and it is just so lovely to welcome Cat Lancaster back into our education webinar space. Cat is the Director of Professional Practice for the Disability and Mental Health Services here in Life Without Barriers. And, you know, if you joined us in our last webinar that Cat presented at, you know that you're in for a really fantastic session today. Cat is highly qualified. She has masters in teaching and special education with postgraduate quals in behaviour disorders and specific learning disability. I mean, Cat is so incredibly knowledgeable. She has a wealth of experience and is a wonderful presenter. So as I said, I know we're in for just a really great session, and I think that I will just I will hand over to Cat. But just before we do that, I would just like to take a moment just to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the lands on which we are working and coming into this presentation from today, to acknowledge that it is land that was never ceded, and to pay our respects to First Nations elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you so much, Cat. So nice to have you here with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me back. How lovely it is. That must have gone okay the first time to go for a second round. So it is lovely to see a few familiar faces and also some new faces today. I would also like to acknowledge the land in which I am coming from. Today, I am lucky to live, work, and play in Nam on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my deepest respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge our Aboriginal colleagues with us today, and just honoring the connection to land and country and culture over millennia. And that this land, as Michelle said, is, was, and forever will be Aboriginal land. So today we're talking about behavior. And before I came to Life Without Barriers, in a previous life, I was a behavior clinician. In fact, I spent a couple of decades. We don't like to talk too much about decades because then you start to date yourself, but I spent a few decades working specifically as a clinician in the behavior space. And one of my areas of, I guess, particular passion was working with children and young people in out-of-home care who had a disability and behaviors of concern. So we're kind of starting to, I guess I'll say that, so I'm happy to take any questions. For those who were in the session last time, you know that I'm pretty free and easy with the way that I like to present. I'm not going to be overly formal about it, though this time I do have a PowerPoint with a few little things here and there, so I might share. But I want you to feel like this is your session. You are professionals and you've come with particular reasons. So obviously put your hand up, ask any questions that you've got. As we're going along, don't feel like you're going to interrupt my flow, because if you don't push the stop button, once I start talking about behavior, I actually don't stop. So feel free to just hit pause on anything you want me to spend more time on. I'll just gonna flick up. That. Now, is everybody feeling like, yeah, you can see the thing that you need to be able to see? Isn't that fantastic? Now, how do I make sure I still get to see all of your fabulous selves? Oh, look at that. So now I've got faces too. So that's a brilliant world. So starting with a little bit of Calvin and Hobbes, because I'm old school like that, also dating myself with the fact that I enjoy Calvin and Hobbes. But this is one of my favorite cartoons. And if you take a look, you've got Calvin completely losing his mind and screaming about the fact that he's feeling crabby and he wants everyone to leave him alone. Grumpy face, stamping. And at the end, nobody recognizes my hints to smother me with attention. And if there's one message that you take from today, and you only walk away with one message, the one that I want you to walk away with is that everybody does what they do for a reason. There is no behavior, no matter how insane it may seem in the moment, that isn't actually purposeful for that person. And if you feel like your brain can hold a second one, then the other thing that I would like you to hold on to is that in almost every instance, that way of engaging, that behavior, is the best way that human knows how to meet their need in that moment. And when I say best, I don't necessarily mean safest, which might be how we measure best, or most socially appropriate, which might be another way of measuring best. What I mean is it's effective, right? That at some point in time, it has worked really well. And that's the thing that they remember. So those are the two things which are going to kind of cover, be the main themes of what we're talking about today. And we can know this here intellectually. I want you to know it. I want you to know it deep inside yourself, right? That every behavior you see serves a purpose. It's functional. And that it's the best way that human, regardless of whether they're a little tiny person or a big old person, it's the best way they know how to get that across. If we start thinking about things being failures to behave properly, and can I just say, I don't even know what behave properly means. I think even that's completely contextual. But that's a whole nother philosophical conversation we could have. But if we believe that there is a benchmark of behaving properly in the universe, then we stop thinking about it as a failure to behave properly.
Let me leave this.
And think instead that it's a failure to communicate properly, right? So it's not about the impact of that behavior, but about the failure of that message, the failure to get across that message in a way that is safe and, and get for everybody who's involved in that moment, right? Then that actually changes often the way that we feel about it. It lets you depersonalize some of what happens. Because when you're engaging with particularly a teenager, and man, they can be cutting. Like teenagers are awesome with their language. I've got 2 of them. So I 100% understand this from a personal experience. Plus, this was my happy place, was playing with young people, right? So they're masters at knowing your soft spots and how to get there. And if you recognize that that's not actually what it's about. In fact, most teenagers and young people actually aren't thinking about you. They're actually not that. They're too self-focused for that, right? So we're thinking it's about us, but actually it has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with the fact that they're trying desperately to figure out how to get across a message, and they don't know a better way to do it. And so we have to always be asking ourselves, and this is my favorite motto, what lies beneath, right? What lies beneath? What are they actually trying to say? And you guys will have seen this before, classic iceberg, but actually, again, it's one of these things that we often think about intellectually, and we don't actually fully take in really in the depth of us understand that the person who's losing their nut in front of us, or the guy who cut us off in traffic, or the kid who put a hole in the wall, or the kid who's cutting himself, or the kid who is binging on food, or whatever it is that they are doing, that the behavior itself is actually not relevant. It's the only part that's really relevant. It's what's sitting underneath that behavior, right? So when people used to come to me as when I was working as a behavior therapist and say, how do I stop this person from hitting? My answer would be, no idea. How do I respond to a person, this person when they're spitting at me? There's no way there's a response of A equals B, because for each individual, you've got to know what it is that it means for them. And I actually have a belief that there's almost no behavior which in and of itself is inherently bad. All right, I want you to stop and think about that. There's really no behavior that we could describe that's inherently bad. It's only problematic in the context in which it occurs. So if I was to take for example, let's talk about assault. Assault is something we would think is inherently bad. But I can guarantee you, if someone came after my boys, they would see a fierce mom. I don't doubt for a second that I wouldn't physically engage in that situation. I would 100% assault someone who tried to get at my children, right? 100%. Crazy American here. I would go all mama bear. I know I would. And I don't think that's a problematic behavior. Right? We can go to another extreme. You could talk about spitting. Spitting, in a lot of contexts, would be considered a problematic behavior. behavior of concern, challenging behavior, behavior which disrupts engagement, however you want to term it, right? But think about the number of sports people you see doing it out on the pitch, right? Because it's just too much saliva built in and they need to keep breathing. Or if you eat something that is off, you swallow milk that's a little bit sour, bet you're going to spit that out. So the behavior itself is not problematic. And there's a freeness in telling ourselves that story. There's a freeness in understanding that not every self-harming behavior is problematic, because getting a tattoo could arguably be described that way. Not every, and it makes us think about how we describe behaviors, right? Because when you just give it a broad label like spitting, hitting, they're actually not telling us anything about what you saw. We got to get really detailed in describing those behaviors, because that starts us on the journey of understanding that iceberg, that what's sitting beneath it. You know, is there something biological there? Is there something emotional there? Is there something cognitive there? And for the young people that you're working with that have a disability, then it's understanding how might that be playing out in terms of their capacity to communicate, in terms of their capacity to understand and process information. It broadens the depths which you need to look and understand what might be going on there for that young person. It also changes our response, because if you think a lot of the time, and particularly in I guess general settings, if our response to behaviors is just to try to get the behavior to stop, right? So often that's what people want to have happen, right? Just make it stop, right? See, we use a stick. We'll take away your iPhone if you do that again. You can't go out at the weekend if you do that again. Or we might use a carrot. We're going to give you a bit more data on that precious iPhone if you blah, blah, blah. Right now, I'm going to tell you that give you a bit more data is a whole lot more powerful than to take your phone away. Actually, research always tells us that reinforcement is stronger. But neither of those things actually will change the behavior in the long term, because neither of them are addressing any of that stuff that sits below, right? You're just sitting at the surface. You're not digging down deep. And real behavior change, you have to change the thing underneath. And you have to either do that by giving them another way to express the same thing in a way that's equally powerful, or you need to take the reason for the message, take away why they have to communicate that, right? Two sides of that coin. So if you want the behavior to stop over the long term, they either not have to have another way to communicate that message. So you've taught a different communication skill that's just as effective. And the just as effective bit is equally important. I'll talk about that more in a second. Or they have to have a reason not to communicate that message. So if the message is, I don't want to be here, then maybe they don't need to be in that environment anymore. So I've pushed my play button. I know that I've gone a little bit there. Any questions or comments so far? No, shaking heads, landing okay. There's been some smiles and nods and things along the way. So I know you guys don't think I'm completely crazy. So that's a win as we're going along. So to understand, you guys will have seen this, to understand, and I'm not going to do a whole lesson here on functional behavioral assessment, but I'm happy to come back and do that. That's more than just like a 5-minute conversation. But one of the things that's really important to understand is that that's the process that we need to be going through, right? We need to be understanding what we would say technically, what is the function of the behavior? Simply put, what's the kid saying? So if you try to think every time you see a behavior, that there's actually a little speech bubble sitting over that kid's head. And when they're, whatever it is that they might be doing, engaging in alcohol, over alcohol consumption, or as I said, aggressive behavior, whether it's verbal or physical, what's the message? What are they actually trying to say here? We use this process of kind of ABC analysis to get at that. So that's looking at the what happens before and the what happens after to understand what shapes that message. Often just in like a short term, the setting events, which is actually knowing what is it about that person that's about their communication style, what's been happening in the day or the weeks leading up to them. often one of the significant things that you guys would be thinking about is what's the implications for trauma for this young person. And I guess one of my challenges to you here is to remember that while trauma is a significant setting event, it is not the only one. And I think sometimes we're so tuned in to the impact that separation and trauma has had on that young person that we forget about the fact that actually other things could be just as much in play. It can be about their disability. It could also just be about the fact they're an adolescent, right? Or just child, and all the same things that come into play for any child are coming into play there. It could be about the fact that they're having challenges within the education system. That may not be just about the trauma. It may be about the way that particular teacher teaches. So really broadening to think about all the factors that are coming into play. Simply put, it's remembering that most behavior falls into one of 4 categories. It's either about getting something. So I want the pizza, and I've learned that if I stand over you and I yell that I want pizza, that sooner or later you're going to capitulate and I'm going to get the pizza. Right? So it's about achieving something, and I don't know a better way to get that thing. I want more screen time, or I want to have an object. It's about escaping something. And I cannot tell you how many times behaviors that result in a person having something removed from them, that was the end game all along. Right? So one of the things that's often really problematic about removing, say, if someone's had a difficult behavior and it's like, well, they don't have to go out socially, that could be actually what they were aiming for. And we need to find another way for them to get there. Otherwise, it's reinforcing it every time that happens. Right? So an escape function is a really significant one, particularly for young people. Seeking attention. And this is where trauma does come into play. And it's an important thing to remember that for young people generally, but particularly young people on a trauma background, any attention is good attention. That understanding of knowing what type of attention, like how to weigh the difference between the types of attention, is one of the things that gets disrupted. Right? So even you yelling at me or being upset with me or engaging with me around something that may seem negative or it's still attention. I've still got you, right? I've got the hook. And so we need to just be conscious of that. And then a lot of it also can be around sensory related things. So where they're trying to escape or get more of a particular type of sensory element. And for your children who are neurospicy, so for our kids who fall into that alphabet soup, ASD, ADHD, ODD, etc., sensory factors are often really significant for them, whether it's either that escaping or trying to get additional sensory input. Because as I think I said last time, as humans, we are driven to try to get to balance. We want to feel centered and balanced in ourselves. As animals, that's kind of something we all strive for. And our sensory processing is the way that we do that. That's true for every human, right? Our sensory processing is how we get balance. For your neurospicy kids, they need more, more extreme elements of that input, either extremely less or extremely more. And so they're throwing those levers all the time to try to get their bodies into that place. Right. So Cat's rules to behavior response. And this is thinking about how we respond to behaviors as it's happening. The first one is majority of your behavior change work happens when there is no behavior happening. So if you're wanting to adjust the way a young person engages with the world, that's what behavior change is, right? You're adjusting the way that young person chooses to communicate. You're adjusting the way that young person chooses to interact. So remember when we're doing that, that's actually a really big decision. Changing how someone chooses to communicate is a really big thing. We should carry the weight of that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. There's a lot of behaviors which actually impact their quality of life. So we want to support them to engage in a different way, but it's still something we should carry with weight. When they're actually escalated, it's not a teaching moment, right? So when they are anxious or angry or distressed, that is not a moment where they're going to learn anything. So when we try to, by using reinforcement or consequences in that moment, they're actually so elevated, they're not going to be processing that lesson. So most of the work that we want to do to change behavior has to occur outside the construct of that behavior presenting. So it's where you're teaching new skills or changing the environment to reduce the likelihood of the behavior or that sort of thing. So remembering that that's where our work is. And one of the things that's often challenging is if you've got a young person who's in a high cycle of behavior, so it's happening frequently, staff are often exhausted. And so the moment that behavior is not happening, what do? We just go, oh, thank God we have a moment. This is our breathing moment. But actually, that's our work moment. So sometimes you have to really gear up to be ready to do the work because it actually requires us to be on in those moments where actually we desperately want to be off. So it's having those honest conversations with yourself and your team about the fact that that's when the work's going to happen if you're really pushing at that. That we can't do the work when they're elevated. And if we've only got those little minute moments, we've got to grab them. The other part to remember is most of the work is ours. Right? Because if we fundamentally understand that for that child or young person, that particular behavior is both serving a purpose and the most effective way they have to meet that purpose, then they're not highly motivated to change that. Even if some elements of it bring a negative consequence for them, the end game, it's reinforcing, right? So in order for us to change that, we've got to do the work, right? As I said, it's either teaching new skills so they have another way to communicate it that's as effective as what they're currently doing. And the reason I say that is, for example, if they engage in a particular behavior because I'll use an example of a child that I worked with. So this young person had high threshold for sensory processing. They did more touch than the average young person. And they engage in quite significant self-harming behavior. So they could cause themselves quite serious damage through punching themselves or head banging. And every single time from the moment they started doing that, so they'd started this behavior at 2, they were now in their kind of early adolescence. Every time they did that, the very first thing mom did, or then carers, because she passed it over to them, was wrap that young person in a big bear hug to restrain their arms so they could no longer hit themselves or bang their head and provide constant reassurance. So in that moment, that child's getting significant sensory input that absolutely meets their needs. They're getting undivided attention from the mom or carer who's involved, and they're getting kind of reassurance and soothing again there. That is immensely reaffirming, right? That's reinforcing everything about that. When you're trying to was trying to teach that young person another way to get mom's attention or to get the carer's attention, because at this point they were living in a residential unit, they would go and ask for a hug or ask for a cuddle, and because they're completely calm, if somebody was in the midst of doing something else, they might say something like, just wait a second. Yep, let me just finish this and I'll absolutely do that. Which means that is not nearly as effective as if I just go and hit myself in the head, because then you're going to stop what you're doing, aren't you? That's going to become the more important thing. So it's not as effective. We've taught them something that's more socially appropriate, but if it doesn't get as immediate a response, they're always going to default back to the behavior that gets more immediate response. And that's that's why I say the work is ours. We've got to be ready to really respond to change the dynamic of that behavior. And then my last rule of thumb is, in a crisis, we have one aim, and that's to do the least harm, right? Again, remembering, not a teaching moment. Nobody's at their best self in a crisis. All we're trying to do is de-escalate the situation. And if we genuinely recognize and understand that that's not when a learning or change is going to happen, then how we de-escalate the situation doesn't matter. Give the Coke. Do whatever we need to do to take it down, and then we regroup and we do the work again when it's a calmer situation, because that's when the learning happens. I think that's my last slide so that I can then read. come back to seeing each other. You seeing me again? Excellent. So I guess I'm curious, what are people's thoughts or what are questions that people have on that? Those are just some general principles for kind of working with understanding behavior. Does that resonate? Is it new? Is it like, yep, that's actually how we operate? How are we feeling about that?
I think it's good for us, but I guess trying to get through to schools about how they respond to these situations, because that's been, yeah, my experience is that sometimes schools, yeah, really don't get it, and they use the suspension as the yeah, to stop the behavior when that's not effective.
Not effective. So with you, Anne, and I think, there's been some coverage recently by SBS around some of the approaches, particularly for children with disabilities, that we're seeing across our school systems. This is where I almost feel like I should come with a caveat, because where I started my profession was as a teacher working with those kids, and I still feel a strong call to education that way. But Australia has got an incredibly punitive system. And so I haven't felt like I was a situation where I was able to engage. So I feel very strongly about the way we do behavior management here in Australia. I feel like we are not applying the positive behavior support approach, which research would tell us is what we should be doing in those contexts. My balance to that would be going, teachers are overwhelmed, and I really feel for them right now. I do think that they're being asked to do a lot of things which are outside their remit. And there's increasing demand all the time. But as a result, they're just wanting it to stop, and they don't have the capacity to come up with another option. So I do think this is where trying to find an ally at the school, there often is one, an administrator or a SLIM, and having the conversation about approaches that you're doing to try to take them on a journey. I wish we could just stop the suspension, because so often that just becomes the kids' mode operandi, right? They're like, well, I don't want to be here. These people don't get me. They're asking me to do stuff. So I know very quickly. I mean, how often do they walk in with like day one coming back and they're already out the door, right? I remember I got a text from a mom just the other day, 45 minutes, Cat. He made it 45 minutes, and because they understand that system way better than we do. And if they try something minor and it doesn't get that result that they want to get out, they'll up the ante, right? And that's the challenge. There has to be a real commitment. I guess that's one of the other things when you're talking about behavior change, if you we remember again that this is their most effective means of achieving that goal. When it first stops working, if you have as a collective decision around trying to shape particular behavior, I guess I have other rules here. So one of my other rules was just pick one behavior at a time. You're not going to change them all simultaneously. You'll lose your ever-loving mind, right? So pick the behavior that either seems most like it's causing most harm, or you might pick the behavior that's actually seems like it's the most straightforward to address, right? So that you get the small win. But just choose one. They usually have a laundry list, these kids, right? There'll be behavior support practitioner, or the school will come with a list of all these things that need to be changed, and you try to come up with a plan that addresses them all. That's never going to work. So you pick your one, and then you've got to kind of be ready for the fact that when that behavior initially stops having the impact that it's always had, you're going to get an escalation, right? Because first they're going to up the ante because it's worked, right? Remember, if you go back to those first things, this served a purpose for me. Why is my communication stopped? Why aren't you hearing me? Right? That's the first thing that's happening there. Why aren't you hearing me? Well, I'm going to make you hear me. I'm going to make you listen. I'm going to up the game, right? And you got to be able to withstand that and maintain consistency and reinforcing that other way of communicating so that they realize that they have another tool in their toolbox that's going to be just as effective.
I've seen that work where because there's been a bit of a myth around ASD, autistic, saying that they don't want to be touched, but that's not actually true. And so my grandson was ASD, and he would just cry, and my daughter-in-law would just leave him thinking that he didn't want to be touched, until one day my other son just went over and picked him up and he stopped crying, and that changed the whole situation. But what you said about the lady hugging the child, that can be seen as like restraint without some of the restraint.
Absolutely.
This is the thing. Where's the lines around this now? When you're like a practitioner, or how do you
So like in something specific like that, I mean, you might do something where as a short-term change strategy that you're going to actually ask people to engage in giving some form of physical input if that's what they're looking for. It might not need to be the bear hug. It might be that you're doing deep pressure around a joint. That's where our sensory receptors are for that. So that, like where it's on a shoulder or a wrist or knees, those you're going to get more input because there's more nerve receptors there. And then you gradually might teach a child to self-restrain or self-soothe in that way. I think some of it is also though about getting your data around that. So if a child is seeking that deep touch, it's going to be because their sensory profile shows that. So good OT should be able to get you the evidence to demonstrate that. And then that can change it to being a proactive strategy as opposed to a reactive strategy or restrictive practice. But it is about really carefully articulating that. And just on your comment, one of my favorite, professionals in the ASD space is Tony Atwood. And one of his quotes, which I use all the time, is if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. There literally is no, what we know is we know a little bit about how the brain functions. We're learning more all the time, but in terms of how that presents and how that manifests, completely individualized. So I think that's again another one of those really important things for us to hold on to. There's not a lot of generalizations that you can make. Just knowing a person's diagnosis, it just tells you where to start exploring. Other questions or thoughts? Very quiet group this time.
Hi, I've just got a question. I think it's just more around just trying to understand for a young person that I have and trying to figure out whether it is the ASD or, is it just a manipulation behavior as well? Or, I think we tend to always paint it as this pain-based behavior is trauma all the time. That sometimes I feel like, for example, I think he always likes to say, I think I've noticed that he says one thing to one person, like in school, that, he didn't get his lunch. And then to another person, he would have said, oh, I just want more food. And when I do a bit of investigation, then we get to know that, carers have given him food, they haven't starved him. But it's just his choice of not eating the lunch. And this has been going on for a while. And I think that really painted a very wrong image of the carers to me as well. That, is this a care of concern here and things like that. And eventually there was one investigation that I did that it just dawned on me that this boy has been saying he's not been truthful to people. And he's been doing this tactic for a very long time. And everybody has been convinced that he is telling the truth, and we never doubted anything else above that. So I suddenly dawned on me whether I haven't looked at it from a very open perspective, just looking at the voice of the child that I've been looking at. And of course he has got ADHD, he has got ASD, and I keep hearing it's the trauma that speaks, that's his trauma behavior. I mean, sometimes very inclined to think that not everything is trauma. And it's just, I think sometimes it's just those behaviors that has been learned. And I think, what is your perspective on this? And I was talking to a behavior support practitioner, and everyone that I speak to, they keep saying it's trauma, it's trauma, it's trauma. But is it really trauma? I really don't know. Or is it just that's this way of just getting things that he wants.
So the answer could be yes to all of that. Which is, I mean, it's a really good scenario you painted there that we could talk to. So one, I do think we have to be careful with our response. It's trauma, because at the end of the day, what is that telling us, right? Sometimes I almost feel like it starts becoming even if it is rooted in trauma, that doesn't mean that the behavior can't change. It doesn't mean that the child can't learn a different way to communicate, and it doesn't take away the onus on us to do the work. It just means that we have that as a lens that we're looking at it, right? So I think I get a little bit kind of, when I hear that, sometimes it feels to me like people are kind of almost putting it out there like, oh, it's a done deal, it's a trauma, nothing can be done, it's this thing that happened in the past. And like that just gives us a way to think. It doesn't actually change what we do in the moment. The other thing I guess I would say is, I'm just going to pick up on your word, and not picking on you, but I'm going to use an example. The way that you said the word manipulation had a connotation as if this was a bad behavior or negative behavior. Oh, they're manipulating, right? And you hear that a lot. But again, if we're going from the conscious of everything a kid does, everything a human does serves a purpose, my question would be, so what would be motivating the kid to tell those stories, right? It could, so if it's manipulation, right? Is it, there's something about, well, this kid doesn't feel like they got a lot of control or power in their life. Everyone feels like they need control or power in their life. Is this the only way they feel like they can enact that? In which case, is there other ways that we could give them opportunity to have control or power and feel like they could enact agency in a situation, so they didn't feel like they had to do it from a deceitful standpoint, right? It's asking yourself what's driving it, right? Excellent to move beyond, is it trauma? Even, also excellent to move beyond, is it diagnosis? Because the answer is always going to be, for a kid who has trauma and a diagnosis, well, yes. Those are lenses you have to look through. They help you understand that child. But that's not the full answer. That's not telling you what the message is. It just may be shaping what the message might be. So this instance, you might be going, well, depending on how that neurospiciness plays out, they may or may not fully understand the fact that they can manipulate somebody else's brain, right? Fundamentally, we know that actually that's something that's really difficult for people on the spectrum, right? Because one of the things that's impacted for people on the spectrum is theory of mind, which is your ability to understand the way other people's minds operate. So to purposely use deceit to change somebody else's mind, it's tricky. It's not that it can't be done by somebody on the spectrum, but much, much harder. So I'm always skeptical that that's actually what's driving it, because it's rarely an end game in the same way. But having control or having some, that's a big one. And if it's a young person coming into that early adolescence, man, that's what I mean. Don't forget how strong a driver that is for young people. They will do all sorts of crazy stuff to get control, right? Because they're so trying to establish themselves independently. So I think that would be kind of what I'd be wondering about in that instance.
Yeah, I actually had I think for a long time I wasn't able to get the answers because everything was quite blurred. Like Karen's would say we always have food for him, and the after school will say there wasn't any food, and he would say he has eaten everything, and everything was a bit of a mystery for a while. And I think one day, I think we just a pin dropped, and I think everything lined up very well. And then that's when was the thinking point for me, the realization point that, oh, okay, so he has been the one who has been, eating up all the food, or he doesn't want to eat the food because he doesn't like it. So he wants more food. So that's when I suddenly realized, also, that is it. Okay.
Great.
And I did have a conversation with him. I did tell him that, it's okay to ask for more food, given that he has got food hoarding because of his ACE. And, it's okay to ask for more food, but what's not okay is to lie about things that you haven't been given food. And, you didn't like the food. So it's okay to be absolutely honest about it, because it's then good that we know what food you like, what food you don't like. or, you know, if it's not enough food, the carers can give you a little bit more food, you know, that sort of thing. So I think suddenly it dawned on him as well. And also I think the transparency too with him. And when like say for example, after school, he would have told after school he wasn't given any food. So I would be there and I'm chatting with them and I say, you know, come here and like, let's have a chat. I heard that you're not being given any food. And that's when the transparency really dropped in. Then he started to really speak the truth. Yeah, no, I think I was given, but I finished it up, and so I needed more food, the sort of thing. So I think the issue was sort of solved, but then I think it made me feel like I was very, my perspective was very shut down because I keep hearing it's trauma. So I keep thinking it's all trauma. Yeah, you know, that's just trauma speaking and things like that. And I think it sort of muddled my perspective a little bit.
Yeah, that's really great, sharing, Nisa, because I think that's so easy for that to happen for all of us, right? To kind of get trapped in a particular way. And I think, you know, even to get trapped in a person's story, right? Like if you've known someone for a long time and they always do something, then that can start becoming a limiting factor. So I think one of the things that's really important when you're trying to understand behavior is to do what you did and stay constantly curious, right? And that's why I said I really love that question, what lies beneath that? Because it's like you that keeps drilling down, right? You keep kind of going further and further with that. So there's things like, you know, it might be about them feeling like they need agency. It might be about that they don't like, as you said, like you were throwing out all of those hypotheses. And when you're confronting a behavior, like one of the greatest things to do is to sit in a room and just throw out what could the messages here be. And then you pick one and you test it. Let's try to see if it's about they don't know how to ask for more food. So let's just reinforce that they have the capacity to do that, and that's totally okay. And we're going to try to address that. And if that deals with the behavior, then we got it. And if it doesn't, then we kept that list of all the other things that it might be, and we're going to go take a look at the next one and go, because maybe actually it's about the fact that everybody trying to unpack this means I'm getting heaps of attention. Everyone's talking to me about they're worried about whether I'm eating food. This is a really effective way to get these one-on-one conversations, right? So there could be another thing. So we'll address that. Well, let's bump up the attention, because the kid is seeking attention, I hate that phrase, but you know, the kid who needs more attention than what they're getting, we got to find a way to give it to them. You actually usually have to go over the top with giving it to them to be able to actually get them to a point that they don't feel like they need to demand it in those ways, which are more difficult. So that was a great example. We all need to be curious like that and not get stuck at the, oh, it's this. As soon as you find yourself defaulting to it's because they're blah, then it probably means it's time to bring in some other minds, bounce things around, get you outside of the box. Other thoughts, questions, scenarios?
Up for one more. I'm just conscious that this time is whizzing past really quickly. But if somebody else has got one more question or comment, we can open up for that.
Can I ask, Kat, for children who feel they need to have someone's one-on-one attention all the time, for whatever reason, and I'm thinking particularly around teachers in a classroom, and there's one child that really feels they need that one-on-one all the time. Can you talk to me a little bit about that, on, you know, why that might be happening, or the first step in understanding or managing that? So I'm talking like at the pointy end, the kids who cannot regulate or feel okay without someone's one-on-one the whole time.
Yeah. So obviously that's not going to get addressed quickly. So some of that's about kind of, I guess, recognizing it's a marathon, not a sprint, to change a behavior like that. So it could be a couple of different things. It could be, and again, this is where you'd have to kind of unpack the need. It could be that they demand it all the time because they're so insecure in knowing when exactly it's going to come that they're not willing to have it stop because they don't know when it would come back again. And that that can be rooted both in frontal lobe and capacity to plan, etc. If you've got a kid with, who's spicy, and also in trauma, where trauma's kind of made it so that unpredictability isn't there. And so then sometimes having a really, really clear schedule that shows exactly when they're going to get that time, and it's entirely predictable, and the teacher has to then be like 100%. You can't miss those moments, right? Because as soon as you miss one, you're all the way back, and in fact, you probably it's going to be harder. Think that it could be that the young person hasn't ever been taught to wait, and it's recognizing that waiting is a skill, and particularly for children with a disability. We often assume that they will, like other children, just learn to wait because people just learn that through osmosis, but actually it's a skill that has to be directly taught. And sometimes you're starting that by teaching a child to wait for literally 5 seconds, and you're making a game out of it and reinforcing that, and then gradually extending that time. Now that is slow and it's painful sometimes, especially if it's been a long time without them being taught that. But it is recognizing that a lot of these skills that we get frustrated with young people not knowing are actually functional skills that have to be scaffolded and taught just like anything else. And that's particularly true for our children where there's a disability that impacts frontal lobe, because you do then have that compounding impact on that executive functioning part of the brain for those kids combined with trauma. So those would be my initial instincts. I guess the other thing I'd be thinking is going, okay, so for a kid like that, in order for them to tolerate something which is intolerable in terms of their belief, then you need to balance out, like, so if you're teaching waiting, like for very things that in the moment where they're being asked to wait, they probably need to be able to engage in a really high impact sensory activity that's for something that they're seeking. And again, it could just be like 5 seconds and expanding, but you can't just expect them to stand in a vacuum. They've got to be getting super reinforcement for learning that new skill, which is otherwise completely undesirable. Why would I not get the thing that I want? You have to kind of reset that. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, because I'm just thinking of some of the extreme examples that I've experienced, and it feels like to me that child feels they cannot survive without that attention. So their whole survival is based on, I need to do anything, doesn't matter if it's good, bad, or whatever, as long as I have that person's undivided attention. So it's really strong for them.
That's right. And so I think if we can kind of recognize that need is real, we might go not functional, not socially appropriate, actually impacting their quality of life because it's stopping them from doing other things, but it's still true for them.
Yeah, it's very true.
Then you're trying to address the message, right? So that kid who needs that much attention for whatever reason, that's what they require right now. So how do we start shaping that in a way that's more functional for them?
Yeah, and that's a real challenge for some of our children in care, because they've had times when they haven't had their needs met and things change all the time. And what you said about the predictability for them of when am I going to get that one-on-one again? Often we can't give them that predictability for their, when they leave school or when they're coming home from school, or that, because that predictability has never been there for them. So I think that was something that, it was something important that we can probably help teachers a little bit more, in this time.
Think about chunking it, right? So teacher's not going to be able to do like that whole process with them over an entire day. But if you're wanting to start teaching, for example, that waiting, it's so having the conversation with the teacher. Okay, what is the half-hour block in a day, or 15-minute block in a day where you could be consistent about that? We just need to find one block where we can start teaching the skill and then gradually expand. So that's the other thing. Often we kind of have an all or nothing sort of approach to changing behavior, really tiny blocks of time, and gradually build out, because that's much more manageable for everybody that's involved.
I also liked what you said about when we're asking a child to wait, we need to give them opportunities for other sensory input so that they're actually receiving something rather than being isolated and alone. So, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Kat. And I'm loath to interrupt this very rich conversation, and you've shared so many insight strategies, lay down a few challenges for us to think more deeply about behaviours and how we respond to behaviours. I think we absolutely need more chats with Cat. So we will bring you back hopefully in 2025 if you are
Happy to.
willing to do that. So thank you so much for your time
Pleasure.
today. Thanks everybody for participating, and look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you.